And I don't need to tell anyone here that the COVID-19 pandemic has been the defining global shock of our time. It's exposed inbuilt weaknesses within society, but also demonstrated that rapid change is achievable. The pandemic has fundamentally changed how citizens, organizations and states perceive risks and question who we trust. And today's event sees the launch of the Forethought Build Better report that brings together the British Science Association's recommendations and learnings from all the discussion events they've been holding for leaders in business, science and policy that took place in February and March this year. And I know many of you were part of those. And this summit is going to be in two parts. The first hour, this one, is going to feature our report launch and panel discussion. That's part A. At 2 o'clock, we're going to have a short break while participants move to the roundtable discussions. And as you know, these are a really fantastic part of these summits. So I do hope that you're going to stay for them. If you don't know which roundtable discussion you're due to join, please let the BSA team know. There are details in the chat if you look for how to contact them about that. Anyone who wishes to contribute to the discussion so that I can feed your comments and questions in to our panelists, you can do so in the stage chat function and or on Twitter or other social media using the hashtag Forethought. But if you contribute in the chat, then I will see your comments and I can put them to the panelists, and feel free to say who you are and who you represent if that's relevant. You'll see automatic subtitles appear on your screen, and if you want to turn them off, please click More, which is on the bottom right of your screen. It's got the 3 dots above it, possibly, and then you can click on Hide Subtitles. So it's the More button and then Hide Subtitles if you don't need them. The first half of the summit is also being streamed live on the BSA's YouTube channel, and viewers can ask comments there in questions there in the comment section. I'll introduce you to our fantastic panelists shortly, but first I'd like to welcome Catherine Matheson, Chief Executive, of course, of the British Science Association, who's going to tell us about the Build Better report and announce it here. Welcome, Catherine.
Thanks, Samira. And as Samira just said, earlier this year, the BSA convened a series of 9 Forethought discussion events that brought together 80 leaders from business, science, policy and civil society. And we had a range of sectors and experiences, from the youth mayor of Oldham to the chief executive of the Met Office, and from the former UK National Security Advisor to the chair of the National Grid. And we asked them how to build a resilient and sustainable future and what the role of science, research and innovation was in delivering that aim. The events centred around 3 core themes: resilience, innovation and environmental prosperity. And it was striking to me that across all the discussions, the same solutions kept coming up: systems thinking, collaboration, building trust and tackling inequality. Our report recommends leaders now take action on 3 areas. Firstly, we want to put future generations at the heart of our institutional and systems decision-making. We are calling on government for a Future Generations Act based on the successful legislation enacted by the Welsh Government. It will require all public bodies to think about the long-term systemic impact of their work when making decisions. We're also calling for businesses and science and research organisations to create future generation advisory boards to enable them to bake in young people's views to the decisions they make. Together, these actions will enable us to build long-term economic, social and environmental value. Secondly, we need to do more to share the benefits of research and innovation across different communities. The invention of the highly successful COVID vaccines show how much we can achieve when researchers, businesses and regulators work together. New technologies can help tackle some of the greatest challenges we face, such as climate change, antimicrobial resistance, and an aging population. But these innovations also have the potential to deepen existing inequalities. We are asking the UK government to support the COVID Recovery Commission's call to create at least 1 new globally competitive industry cluster in every region and nation of the UK by 2030. Currently, the research and innovation workforce is unrepresentative, and we all need to do more to support and invest in diverse innovators of the future. And in the wake of the G7 summit, we want leaders from across society to define the kind of global role that the UK should aspire to. Thirdly, ahead of COP26, we are calling for the creation of a new long-term leadership coalition to deliver the UK's net zero ambition. based on an idea first suggested by Cambridge Zero and inspired in part by the success of the 2012 Olympic Delivery Board, and made up of leaders from business, policy, research, and civil society. They can look at climate financing levers, support business to make changes, and ensure communications reach every community. What underpins our 3 calls to action is that they are the result of people from different sectors, listening and sharing their experiences and views. These challenges are too complex to be viewed from a single perspective. At the BSA, we are passionate about bringing different groups together to discuss and decide on the future of our society. The report also features a series of calls for thought, which we think need focused attention from leaders like you if we are to realise the role of science, research, and innovation in building a resilient and sustainable future. And that's exactly what we're hoping to do here today. Thank you.
Catherine, thank you so much. And what we hope to do now in the next hour is I'm going to introduce our panelists, and then we're going to talk around each of these kind of key recommendations and get a sense of what can be done and the way to look at it. So I'll introduce them in alphabetical order. Kumsal Bayazit is Chief Executive Officer of Elsevier, Information and Analytics for Global Research and Health. We also joined by, and I have to see if I've written these down in alphabetical order, I may have made that bit up, Arunma Oteh, who's founder and chair of the Centre for Climate Repair and UK Special Representative of Climate Change. Professor Sheila Rowan, Director of the Institute for Gravitational Research at the University of Glasgow, and until very recently, of course, Chief Scientific Advisor for Scotland. We're also joined by Steve Varley, who's a Global Vice Chair for Sustainability at EY, leading their climate change agenda, and matched beautifully by his backdrop, and is also a former member of the advisory group to the Prime Ministers, both David Cameron and Theresa May. And last but never least, Lord David Willetts, Chair of Forethought, of course, President of the Foundation's Advisory Council and Intergenerational Centre, and a former Minister for Universities and Science. Welcome to you all. So the first area we wanted to talk about was what can be learned from the COVID-19 pandemic to construct a resilient, innovative and prosperous future for all. And I was really struck by the fact that one of the things that came out at the G7 summit was, oh, we're going to give 1 billion vaccines, to the developing world. And it was pointed out that actually 15 billion would actually be needed for it to be meaningful. So I'm very conscious of the gap between what people say they want and the reality of how it's achieved. I'm going to start with Lord Willetts on this. What are your thoughts? And everyone's going to speak for 2 minutes each on this issue.
Yeah, well, thanks very much, Samira, and thanks for chairing this event for us, and thanks to Catherine for an excellent summary of a really important report that we've just produced. So I think there are several lessons. First, having national capacity matters, and the contrast between how we in the UK responded to the need for protective equipment and the need for vaccines shows that what you can do in your own country matters. And I know there's a lot of global lessons, and you've hinted them at already, and we've clearly got responsibilities to share our vaccines with the wider world. But I think a lot of governments will be concluding having an industrial base has been quite an important determinant of the quality of your response. So I think we will see less reliance on global supply chains and more investment in domestic capacity. I would add, secondly, as this is the British Science Association, I think it's overall been good for science, but there are also some big challenges we face. First of all, I've always felt a bit nervous when I've heard ministers say we're following the science, as if science gives an automatic, unchallengeable recommendation, do X, not Y. But it doesn't work like that. There are uncertainties about the data, and there are disagreements about what the right policy response is, depending on everything from your ethical presumptions to what you think is the economic impact. So science is a lively conversation. It's not a set of absolutely strict instructions that passive recipients then have to follow. And I think and one of our problems, which you bring out in the report today, is not enough people are part of this conversation. And one reason not enough are part of it is the monstrous early specialization in English education, which means that there are too few people who feel able to engage with science because they've they've studied, have so few opportunities to study it when they're at school. So broadening the science conversation is a second lesson. I would say, thirdly, that there does appear to be some evidence that the national governments that have responded best have been ones where their nations were strong across a wider range of disciplines. And it's great we've got Kumsal joining us from Elsevier, because one of the great things that they contribute to this analysis is their famous cobwebs, identifying for different countries the quality of their research measured by citations being greater than the global average in that discipline. And the shape of the cobwebs, I find a fascinating insight into, to put it very crudely, what countries are good at and what they're not good at. And some countries have very skewed cobwebs. They're really good at some things, but not so good at others. Others have a more evenly distributed cobweb. And my final observation is it does look as if having a more evenly distributed cobweb, having a wider range of capacities to research and hence absorb other people's lessons, does seem to lead to better capacity to respond to this crisis. So we should follow the Elsevier analysis.
Thank you very much, David. Our next contributor now is Kumsal Bayazit. What are your thoughts?
So I'll pick up on some of what David said, but for me, I think from a global perspective, the most important thing we need to learn lessons from is to be able to develop a vaccine in 260 days. What used to take 10 years was done in 260 days. And I think a key ingredient of that has been the global collaboration and alignment between corporations, academia, as well as the government and policymakers. When this entire system was aligned with a goal and the incentive to deliver the vaccines, we saw extraordinary pace of change. We also saw the power of scientific collaboration among academic researchers and corporate R&D, but also multidisciplinary research, which drove this extraordinary innovations and breakthrough. And going back to David's point, UK has a real competitive advantage here because of its strength across all the different scientific disciplines in being a real powerhouse in driving multidisciplinary research. As we think about the achievement around the vaccines, of course, funding was widely available for these efforts during the pandemic, and we should not underestimate the importance of access to resources. And the world also prioritized this one issue, which is also rare. So as we try to recreate some of these results in peacetime, we need to take these into consideration. But I think the model we saw last year, this global alignment on the need to tackle a grand challenge and pulling together a society, that is something we can replicate as we think about climate change, healthcare, education, or food security. And as we think about creating that kind of alignment, I think there's a lot to reflect on how we evolve capitalism to work for all stakeholders, including improving inequalities that manifested profoundly during the pandemic. And a lot of the themes that came out in your report resonated with me as key ingredients to achieve that evolution, primarily trust, really important, systems thinking, as well as collaboration. So the question now is, how do we take these lessons learned pragmatically and start applying them? And I also want to follow up on what David said around the science, because society, I think, has seen last year that science is not a set of fundamental, undisputed truths, but it's knowledge that continuously evolves and refines, and you mitigate risk and make the best decisions that you can based on the evidence available at a given point. And again, I think it's very important to build trust for that process in society.
Thank you so much. And leads beautifully into Professor Rowan, who are just thinking in the last year in particular of your role as a scientific advisor for Scotland. You know, you've absolutely lived at the heart of what's been going on with the pandemic. Your thoughts on this issue?
Thanks. So I'm in violent agreement actually with some of the points we've had so far. I think one of the chief lessons we've had is that when challenges are so complex and far-reaching, they really do need many actors in society to pull together, scientific, governmental and civil society, to work in concert to face these challenges. And even inside any one of those, inside science, the spectrum of activity that has been needed has been broad. Everything from fluid mechanics to understand airborne exposure and protection from the virus and informing policies and distancing and face coverings, structural studies of the virus to inform vaccine development, all the technological developments that underlie the enabling of what has been a remarkable switch to remote working and virtual delivery of services that we have become so used to. And those contributions have come, again, from a wide range of places: national labs, university research, and private industry. Again, and they have all been critical in helping us face this challenge. And it's a lesson, if ever we needed it, that it is essential to have breadth in our research base, breadth in our technological base, and in our innovation infrastructure. And it needs to be there to draw on, because it cannot be created from nothing overnight. It's not an optional extra, and without it, society will not be equipped to face the next challenges to come, whether it's further pandemics, whether it's climate change or more. I think perhaps the fact that none of us can escape some of these other challenges, climate change is the clear example, might encourage us to think that people are actually more prepared to accept dramatic changes in how we live than we might previously have believed, if they understand the need. And I think we've also learned that the public have a real desire for presentation of the evidence that informs and underpins decision making, and that they want to hear that directly from scientists and from leaders. They're interested in hearing that directly. And I think that gives us a dual challenge in equipping and empowering researchers and scientists to be able to communicate clearly to a wide range of audiences, and at the same time, and David mentioned this too, to equip and empower citizens to have the science capital to engage with those messages. And that's another essential thing from my point of view. David talked a bit about the need for domestic capacity. I think I would just say our societal problems are global, and their solutions will be global, and I think we do need to face up to that.
Fantastic, thank you. Right, on to our next speaker now, who I actually need to introduce correctly with your own actual career biography. So my apologies for my error. But Arunma Oteh is former treasurer of the World Bank and is at the Said Business School at the University of Oxford, where she's the executive in residence. Welcome, and your thoughts on the lessons from the COVID-19 pandemic. And my apologies.
Not at all, Samira. I'm passionate about climate issues, so I kind of felt, that new role would be good as well. But thank you very much to the British Science Association and to John Fitzmaurice, particularly for encouraging me to be on this distinguished panel. I almost said I agree with everything that's been said, but let me just add and amplify some of the issues that I've heard in terms of lessons learned from COVID-19. For me, the first and most important one, and Sheila alluded to it when she said solutions have to be global. The world is borderless. We're very interconnected, poor and rich, large and small. We've seen that COVID-19 didn't discriminate between poor people and rich people, or poor countries and rich countries. And as the G7 has moved towards focusing more global, I think they're actually building trust in society. So that's one. The second is the value of science, the value of R&D, the value of innovation. And Kumsal, you pointed, and the report points to the fact that, and maybe I should say human ingenuity, a vaccine production takes the best, from what I've read, it's been about 5 years, but generally 10 years. And within a year, we're able to deploy vaccines around the world. So innovation is key, and science is at the center of it. The third for me is leadership. Leadership counts. And what we've seen is that countries that did better were those who emphasized some attributes which people consider female attributes. So empathy, compassion, emotional intelligence, managing in complexity. I think women manage very well complex situations. I would add that preparedness is key. And from my experience working in finance through my career and dealing with all kinds of crises, you find that even if your preparation is not directly related to what's happened, your muscles are ready to respond. So those who had dealt with Ebola, SARS, Zika were much more ready. I would add, I would emphasize the point, Kumsal, that you made about this is preparation for climate. It's preparation for tackling poverty, because in my view, poverty is the root of everything. I would then add digital. I mean, the world has gone digital, and we're not sure whether when you do the maths globally that it's all good. And so paying attention to the fact that the world may, the divide between the rich and poor may be higher because of digital, paying attention to issues around more frequent cyber attacks. We've followed what's happened in the US with the colonial pipelines, with JB Foods, is also extremely important. So I think that society is more aware of uncertainty and that things can hit us very, very quickly. And that when we respond together, that we go farther. So let me stop there because you wanted us to be very quick in our
Yeah,
intro.
and also it sets up beautifully for the next topic we're going to have. So Steve, your thoughts on this, and then we'll get the discussion going.
Oh, thanks, Samira, and thanks to the British Science Association for putting together such a fantastic panel on the back of such a great report. And I'll also say it's a blessing to be the last in the line of such clever, smart panelists who've already illuminated so many topics. Sometimes it can be a curse to be the last person, but Samira, this is a blessing. So where would I start here? Well, I'm sure we've all read the report. I think the clever part about the report's framing is where it talks about the short-term calls for action, as well as medium-term topics for further thought. And those three themes have emerged of resilience, innovation, environmental prosperity, alongside the recommendations, I think are hard-hitting and insightful. So that's the good news, but maybe let's just reflect a little bit on what one would say is the less good news. I don't think we've got time really for medium thoughts. As one of my mentors used to say, the medium is now, And I think as we reflect on the ideas within the report, we also need to consider our special place in the world. We all hope, towards the back end of the pandemic, but the pandemic is still alive in too many countries around the world. There's a statistic yesterday that only 1% of the Namibian population have been vaccinated, 1%. So whilst we framed ourselves as a national constitution, as an island, alongside many of the other speakers that have already added their thoughts to this, we have a global responsibility. Now, the ideas in the report, I think, do have global applicability. So there's the good news. And whilst we frame this with the British Science Association as a launch of the report, maybe, Samira, we can all consider this the launch of a global movement to go after these recommendations. So it's like a movement. It's a movement to implement. We're in action here, but not just nationally, but globally, because I think we have a lot to offer. And my word, the world at the moment needs a lot of help. I'll leave it there, Samira.
Thank you so much, Steve. Well, both you and Arunma, before you've kind of led us very nicely into the next area I wanted to discuss, which is if we talk about resilience, several of you have discussed the importance of having kind of whole systems thinking, future decision making needing to be thought about now. And I just wonder, I don't know who wants to kick this one off, but what leaders need to focus on in identifying and perhaps building slack into their systems? I mean, one of the big issues is the lack of slack. And then there's also the issue of working across different sectors, which has proved one of the big challenges of COVID. It's been positive in some ways, but also exposed some terrible challenges over, for example, contracts for delivering things like PPE, certainly in the UK. Who wants to take this first? So that whole issue of whole systems thinking into future decision making. I wonder if Sheila, you might comment. Is that unfair to ask you, just having just recently been at the heart of government decision making on COVID, what lessons you can learn from that?
So it's in terms of whole systems. I mean, I think where the lessons we've seen here are that when you do have good and strong and focused connections between the different parts of society, you really can make a tremendous impact. And so, going forward, what can we take from that in understanding how the value of the different sort of, I view it as a system of cogs and wheels that represent the different parts of society that need to work together, and that they can connect to deliver an enormous impact only if they join up. and only if each of those parts is there. And you know, so when earlier I talked about the breadth of things that we need, I think it does take that perspective in having an underlying set of sort of tools to draw on, whether that's our research base, whether it's our innovation sort of ecosystem, and or whether it's our, you know, distribution and supply sort of capacity in the UK. Sort of it needs that breadth of perspective, and also the links between, you know, the embedded sort of cultural ability and desire for those different parts of our sort of national society to connect. And I think, you know, there are parts where the UK is very strong. I think what we've seen here is we can do tremendous things if we have the ability to join that up in a focused fashion.
Thank you. Sorry, did you want to finish your point?
No, and that I think thinking about what lessons we can take there and, you know, forward, I think is clearly something that's on many people's minds.
Thank you, Steve.
Sure, it's just a small point, really. I think the report is extremely well written, and the pieces on whole systems thinking are well worth revisiting for us all, I'm sure. But it's also, I'm also struck by how small things can make a difference. My sister works in the NHS, and maybe a couple of years ago, while she was very proud about her job, maybe that wasn't a pride that everybody shared. But the use and amplification of framing this as my sister being an essential worker, isn't that a wonderful use of the English language, just with that one small nudge? And I'm reminded of Richard Thaler's book on nudges, the Nobel Prize winner. Just one small nudge in the whole system, I think, tilts us all to now start to think about NHS workers and many others as essential. They're essential workers. I think that's one of the small revelations in a positive sense to come out of the last 14, 15 months. That small changes, even just of language, gets us to reframe a situation. I think that's incredibly powerful.
Yeah, although of course it doesn't do away with the outstanding issues about were staff being properly paid, was there enough staffing, all the rest of it. But you're quite right. Can I just throw one point into this discussion, which Alison Gallagher, or apologies if I've mispronounced your last name, Alison, has suggested. What do folks think about the beneficial shift to national versus global supply chain, and will the consumer be willing to pay a bit more if needed? Because that has changed the way that countries have behaved around this. David, do you want to?
Yes, I do think, and of course there are high-minded and practical reasons for having a global focus, but it is just worth reminding people that the national community matters to people, the sense of the community to which they belong, and they do feel obligations more widely globally. But but national identity matters, and it's the unit within which our democracy is conducted. And I think I'm the only member of the panel who has had to win votes in elections, though I've now retreated to the safety of the House of Lords. And democratic politicians are accountable for their country. Now, you can win prudential points by saying, look, you know, people move around the world. We also want to tackle the virus elsewhere. But national communities and national democratic accountability are powerful forces. And it's not that politicians are bad people. They're responding to those responsibilities which they have.
Another issue I'm going to feed into this discussion on whole systems thinking. Again, it's a question that's come in from Jeremy Silver. Really interested to hear Arunma mention the digital aspect of the pandemic. And digital transformation, obviously, several of you have said, has moved forward so fast. But what does the panel think is needed in anticipation if the next global virus turns out to be human-centered, not to be human-centered, but to be a digital one that might impact our digital platforms globally? It comes back to that issue, and I think you were making it, Kumsal, as well, about anticipating all these things and planning ahead. I don't know if you want to take that next, and then Arunma first, maybe, as it was picking up on your point, and then Kumsal.
Samira, please forgive me, because I do think that both the points that Steve and David highlighted are important to reinforce. David made the point around the shift in thinking and understanding the value of nurses. My mother was a nurse, but I think it connects also to the shift globally. And Kumsal mentioned it in her opening, of multi-stakeholder approaches, where everybody understands the value of not just one stakeholder making money, but thinking about the whole system and what it means for each person. You know, what does it mean how you treat your employees? What does it mean your responsibility to society and other stakeholders? To David's point, I would say that it's not either or. You need to take care of the national agenda, but you need to make sure that it's part of the global agenda. Because we've had cases, even in respect of COVID-19, that if various nations were focused more globally, that we would not be as far down as where we are. So it's a mix of both. But engagement allows that, so that your citizens understand the value of being national, but at the same time being global. I believe that we're one human race, and we need to make sure that we have frameworks that are accountable, that make people accountable, that are clear. And if you go back to issues of systems thinking, if you have clarity, if you have engagement, if you involve various stakeholders, you can move further ahead. I mean, look at the G7 this year and the G7 at a different time when you had a different president of the United States. You can still work together and have your individual agendas. On digital, I gave examples of the Colonial Pipeline in the US, the attack by ransomware, the JB issues. We're already at that point where we need to tackle digital issues forcefully, and I hope that the advanced nations will lead that effort, because we don't want whether rogue states or rogue companies to bring us down, because when you get to a digital platform, the consequences are huge. Thank you.
Kumsal.
Yeah, I think one thing I want us to be conscious of, whether it's the essential worker versus the knowledge worker, the national agenda versus the global agenda, the digital versus the non-digital, what I worry about is we have seen polarization come through over the last decade, more polarization on issues, which I think then prevents this multi-stakeholder efforts where stakeholders can come together to tackle an issue, because there's so much black or white thinking instead of nuanced thinking that's fueled in society due to social media and sound bites. And I think a lot about how do we overcome that. And it was interesting to me that trust came up as one of the most critical issues in the discussions that fueled the report. And that doesn't surprise me, because trust is key to getting things done. And George Shultz, the former US Secretary of Labor, Treasury and State, recently passed away at age 100. And he wrote a wonderful op-ed in the Washington Post just before he died on trust. And he said, trust is the coin of the realm. When trust was in the room, whatever room that was, good things happened. When trust was not in the room, good things did not happen. Everything else is in details. And I genuinely believe for us to overcome the big societal challenges we're facing, like climate change, which is global in nature, or food security, which is global in nature, or cybersecurity, which is global in nature, it's really important to continue to build trust between nations, between corporations and public, government and public, academia and public, because without that trust, I don't think we can bring together the right vantage points and thinking to tackle the large challenges we have, or be able to get enough support for it globally to move them forward. So I do think we have a responsibility to make sure that we stay away from polarization and focus on multi-stakeholder engagement.
Okay, thank you. I want to move this on a little bit in the discussion to talk about innovation and how do we share the benefits of research and innovation across different communities. And I saw there was already a comment from one of the participants pointing out that, it's Carol Monaghan, the essential nature of the NHS workers is a point well made. However, we rarely consider researchers as essential. When will we stop valuing these individuals, including through proper pay? This will need a more responsible approach from many businesses. So again, bringing it back out to the bigger question is, in terms of innovation, sharing the benefits of research and innovation across different communities and how we achieve that. Who wants to go first? I mean, Kumsal, I wonder if it's one for you to actually start on.
Sure. I mean, I think if you think about sharing research, the benefits of research and innovation across different communities, I think there are 2 points I'd like to make there. First is we need to ensure that we continue to invest in R&D. Pretty much every government, UK, US, China, Japan, France, in the last 12 months said they will increase investment in R&D and research and development. But budget cycles are still to be gone through, and we'll see how much of those promises will be funded when there's so much government debt. And I think it's really important to continue to invest in research and development to make sure that there is continuous innovation. The second thing around benefits of research and information about different communities, I think the pandemic revealed the devastating inequalities that continue to exist in society. We knew it was necessary for us to act on these before the pandemic, but the reality is it was the underrepresented communities and minorities that were significantly more impacted by the virus. Kids from economically disadvantaged backgrounds fell behind in their education compared to their peers. Access to vaccines varied widely around the world. Women researchers, we did some research that showed women researchers lost ground during the pandemic because they stopped publishing at the same rate as men. And if you look at how inequalities widened or closed historically, there are rarely silver bullets. It takes millions of small movements coming together to move the needle in one way or the other. And I think this is where we really need to focus on research and innovation and the impact of that across the board. Even the way we do research today doesn't factor in, most of the medical research does not factor in gender or race into the research design. Changing those practices is going to make a difference to make sure all parts of the society can benefit from the research.
One of the things that people are pointing out in the chat, the terrific points and questions being raised, is the need for long-term thinking. And the reality is we have a very short-term nature of the political cycle, both Max Liu and I think Andrew Harrison making this point, for both business leadership and political leadership. If we're trying to do long-term thinking about research and innovation, how can we achieve that? David, do you want to come in on this next?
Yeah, and this whole challenge of kind of systems thinking, which came out very clearly in the report today. Let me offer a pitch for economics, if it's properly done, as a very useful tool for systems thinking, because it does solve the problem of kind of commensurability. It provides a framework within which you can put a whole host of different factors. If you get it correctly, it's not simply the operation of a market. And the best recent account in all this is Partha Dasgupta's excellent report on the economics of biodiversity. Now, it's a massive document, it's 800 pages, but the opening statement by him, one of our leading economists who deeply cares about the natural world, I think identifies how economics has gone wrong and how it can be turned right. He says the problem is GDP, and the first part of the problem is the G. It's gross. It doesn't allow for depreciation. If you are destroying your environment, you can still be apparently doing well on GDP. And he says we should look at assets, not flows, and we should look at the net of depreciation, not gross. And so he says, instead of thinking about national income, think about inclusive wealth. And of course, he wants things like the natural world around us to be part of that stock of wealth. And I personally think it's a really exciting agenda for using the tools of economics for us to think system-wide and to invest in ways that increase our stock of wealth in its broadest sense, which includes human capital and natural capital. And I think that if that tool were developed the way that after the Keynesian revolution, the tool of the measurement of GDP was developed, if that new tool was developed, I think it'd be a really powerful one.
Thank you. Who wants to go in next? Steve and Arunma. I was wondering about your thoughts. Arunma first and then maybe Steve, yes?
Oh, I was going to say that Lord David Willetts' point around really thinking beyond the way that we measure today is so crucial. You can't manage properly what you can't measure properly. And as we think about a multi-stakeholder approach, really defining what success means, redefining what success means is important. And when we think more broadly beyond GDP, it is a way to redefine success. So we're not stacking countries by how much they've built up, but we're also taking out what they're taking out from the world. So I'll give an example. It's not self-serving, but Africa contributes, I think, 1 to 2% of the greenhouse gas emissions. And so that even if, yet it's energy poor, 72% of the people who don't have energy access, electricity access, are from Africa. So if you have the same pressures on the African continent in terms of when they get to net zero. What you're doing is penalizing the African countries. I'm not actually giving them a chance to even get to that point. So monitoring, rigor in understanding and redefining what success means. And success is not GDP. Nobody eats GDP. You eat more than GDP. I would also like to say that we cannot waste this crisis, because I think it was the global CEO of McKinsey in his podcast who said the last pandemic we had, we spent $1.1 billion on research. We spent $180 billion on research to get out of COVID so far, and still counting. So front loading, scale, providing funding today is more important than providing it in the future. And you've seen it with what's happened with the advanced nations versus the developed nations. So I just wanted to add that perspective as well.
No, thank you.
And by the way, Samira, we need to accelerate that push to broaden beyond GDP.
Well, I think that's the key issue, is the how, isn't it, Arunma? Steve, as I bring you, I'm just going to throw a comment that's come in. This is from Matt Locke. It's interesting that the conversation around R&D and innovation has shifted in the last few years towards solving global problems, whereas in the period of up to 2015, it felt innovation was driven by venture capital investment. Are we in the early years of a new era of innovation for social goals? And if so, how can we get the companies that became fabulously wealthy in the last era of innovation to contribute to this new era? So I'll just throw that into the background. But Steve, your thoughts on this?
Well, maybe we pick up another theme from the report here around what I think maybe Mark Carney would call the tragedy of the horizon, in that the democratic machines that many countries exist within, ours of course, the USA, but not all, China is a notable exception, but that democratic machinery, once every 4 to 5 years, the cogs turn once again. And the same for the tenure of CEOs that run these major companies. The average tenure of FTSE 100, a Fortune 500 CEO tends to be between 4, 5, 6 years. And then research grants, a common horizon is 5 to 6 years. So we seem to have locked ourselves into quite a medium-term horizon to solve some really long-term systemic issues. That's a problem, isn't it? And one of the bits I like about the report is the idea that we create some, in the UK, some delivery boards that exist above that changing democratic machine, above the CEO tenure, that have a longevity to support us, to help us navigate through to solutions. And maybe this is where I wonder, Samira and everyone, whether the UN will play an even greater role, whether WHO will play an even greater role. These are significant institutions that maybe over the past years and decades have fallen on maybe less energetic times. And now is the time to revitalize those global institutions who have a very long-term vision and get them to carry forward many of the challenges that we see today.
Sheila.
Yeah, I mean, just to pick up on some of those points, there's an interesting example, I think, in Scotland, where the government has defined and articulated its goals through what's called the National Performance Framework, which talks about outcomes, and it does actually then gather data and evidence in terms of how it's progressing towards those, but they are quite broad and they actually align with the UN Sustainable Development Goals, and it's a very different way in terms of thinking about governing and delivering for a country and what the outcomes should be. It doesn't negate some of the other things we've talked about, but it includes a broader set of things in terms of, as a government, what you're delivering for society. And I think that's a very interesting way to think about some of these things.
Absolutely, thank you. And I just throw another comment that's come in. Helen Zersky, apologies. The pandemic showed us that underlying systems are creaking. There's lots of talk about the importance of science, but our academic researchers still often don't have secure jobs, don't have joined up funding, don't have time to do research because of admin. How do we motivate governments to fix the underlying infrastructure, the foundations properly, at the same time as worrying about the shiny new projects? I think that's something that has kind of, it's an observation really about the background to this discussion. I'm going to move us on to the fourth area I want to focus on in the time that we have, which is environment. And obviously it's come up throughout any discussion about the pandemic, which is part of the big crisis facing us and the challenge of it, how can leaders be enabled and encouraged to lead from the front on climate change? We're very conscious that, of course, COP26 is happening this autumn in Glasgow. There's a lot of talk, there's a lot of promises. One wonders about the role of environmentally conscious, purpose-led businesses. Who would like to start on their thoughts about this one? Kumsal and then Arunma.
Maybe I'll start. So I think this has to be a key priority, and it goes back to sort of evolution of capitalism point I made before. So at RELX Group, which is the parent group for Elsevier, which is a FTSE 20 company, we were net zero in 2020. And we were net zero for Scope 1, Scope 2 emissions, and within Scope 3 for travel. And now we're tackling Scope 3, which is a much larger challenge. And we did that very much like we would do any long-term corporate project. We set out targets in 2010 for 2020 for 10 years, and now we've set out targets again for 2025. And we're working very systematically through how do we decrease our carbon emissions. And there was real decrease to the degree of 40 to 50% in that time frame. And then the rest we achieved through offsetting. And I think when it comes to climate change, I remember telling David in 2020, just before the pandemic, that I had a 10% target to decrease travel in 2020, and I wasn't sure how I was going to achieve it. And guess what? That is the only target I aced in 2020. But going into 2022, we are going to decrease our travel versus 2019 by 50%. And we did it in a mathematical way. The teams did all the math and gave me a budget. I have 7 trips I can take in 2022. So I need to decide how I'm using it. And that's what they did with everybody in the company. So I think it's really important now to take these sort of overall targets and break them down into small targets, empower people in our organizations, and start making those small movements that add up to actually moving the needle over time, instead of being overwhelmed by the large targets that's sort of staying ahead of us.
Thank you. Arunma next.
Sorry, can you hear me?
Yes, Arunma, we can hear you very well. Are you happy to?
Thank you. No, I was just, Kumsal gave a very practical examples. I was just going to say that we must be clear as to the performance metrics. Sometimes when I hear governments say they'll be net zero by 2050, I'm like, the leaders won't be there. So clarity as to the path to whatever they have committed to. So accountability for me is extremely important, and how those are monitored and milestones on an annual basis to 2050. The second is that we've made progress on common standards. Issues around climate, there's a lot of issues around what do you monitor, what standards do you use? And I like that many countries are leveraging the recommendations on the task force on finance-related climate disclosure, and the report does talk about it. And I think the UK is making that reporting mandatory by 2050, by 2025 in the UK, and I think another 50 or more countries. I think SASB has been giving very specifics about how you report. So let's move from talking to doing. The other is the earlier point I made about when you redefine success, then people get rewarded for being successful. So an example that I would give is credit rating agencies are making some progress in including environment in the credit rating assessment. That needs to be accelerated. Finally, a point that I hadn't made earlier, which I want to make, is that the government is important. It provides a framework, but private sector controls a lot of resources. If you take money that is in the hands of asset managers, privately managed funds, about $200 trillion. So when you hear people like the BlackRock CEO chairman hold the feet to the fire of the companies that they're invested in, that helps in making progress. So we need to start doing much more. And activists needs to be more specific in holding people's feet to the fire. In 2015, there was an agreement to provide $100 billion for climate finance. That hasn't been done. So there are a lot of announcements now we need to be doing. Thank you.
Yeah, it's also made me think about the Exxon sort of big shareholders who've kind of pushed a big change in their fossil fuel policy. We've also seen the court case of Shell, of course, in the Netherlands. Who wants to come next? Steve, do you want to go next on this?
Yeah, sure. Just on this topic, and then
David, and then Sheila.
But let me start with Exxon. For those who haven't tracked the Exxon story, it is absolutely fascinating. You can find the letter that engine number one, the activist shareholder, sent to ExxonMobil on this topic. They held less than $40 million of equity in this multi-billion-dollar company, and they've now secured 3 seats on the main board. This is unheard of territory, just from one theme of climate change and accusing the ExxonMobil board of not moving quickly enough. It is absolutely incredible. And I would say this area of sustainability, not just climate change, but ocean health, plastics, I've heard it framed as we are all in, we in business are all in an accelerated Darwinian cycle, not measured by generations, but measured by months and single years. If I use my organization in the UK as an example, we're the 2nd or 3rd largest graduate recruiter. We recruit 1,100 undergrads a year. We employ 17,000 people in the UK. The average age is 27. They've told us that if we are not hyper progressive on sustainability, including climate change and including plastics, they see us as a far less attractive employer. And we will lose talent. We won't retain, we won't attract, we won't recruit. And without having 17,000 fantastic people, we are not very much. We've got a bunch of technology, but we're a real people-led business. So for those that aren't taking sustainability very seriously, I would say you're in an accelerated Darwinian cycle to demise. There's that great phrase by, I think it was someone, a very clever strategy professor that came up with a wonderful phrase of culture eats strategy for breakfast. I think the new thing with that is sustainability eats strategy for breakfast. If you don't have a strategy that's sustainable, if you don't have a strategy that includes sustainability, you will be someone else's breakfast.
David, I'll bring you next, but I just want to add a part of a point that Joe Swinson was making in the chat. The trouble is efficiency and maximizing shareholder returns to the exclusion of all else have created, she would say, a brittle, grotesquely unequal society. We need a fundamental mindset change. And I think that gap still between talking the talk, which a lot of corporations do, and the reality of shareholder returns and expectations and the business model that is used to measure success remains a challenge for politicians and business leaders, doesn't it?
Yeah, and I think Joey's got a very fair point there. I just wanted to focus a bit on politicians and the long term, because I think the debate, we get off on the wrong foot. If we either think politicians are particularly bad, short-termist, evil people, or if we expect them to be heroically long-termist, looking way beyond current political pressures. My view is that if you just think of politicians, and by and large, like everyone else, they want to keep their jobs, they want to do their job quite well, they care about the pressures they're under, including from their voters. They're not going to be heroic, because they're not kamikaze pilots, but equally, they by and large would like to feel good about their work and think they're trying to make the world a slightly better place. So what is it then that a politician would find appealing in the green agenda? And I think there are two. First of all, for us in the UK, the fact that the green investment and the green pressures are clearly opportunities very widely spread across the UK. The fact that the North Sea is a great place for offshore wind, the fact that we've got we've got some big estuaries that you could use for tidal power. If you could do carbon capture and storage, reusing North Sea oil facilities. So the geographical spread of green investment is something that politicians really like. First point. And the second point is that we've now had 2 unsuccessful attempts. We've just recently had we've had the Green Deal and we've had the Green Homes Grant not working out. And one reason has been a boring practical one, which is we haven't done enough training of the people to deliver these programs. And jobs is always a very hot political issue. And saying we're going to train people so that they can properly install clean energy technologies. We're going to train people so they can go around making the existing housing stock more energy efficient. Because to be honest, it's the training problems that have led to the failure to deliver some of these really ambitious programs. So politicians are willing to put money in and they're willing to be ambitious, but they don't then organize the mundane bit. So better training and spread across the country are very attractive political messages. And that's how I would pitch greenery.
Thank you. Sheila, I was very conscious that, you were working closely with politicians in Scotland, and Scotland is that the thing of its own government, part of the UK, and then the global picture too. What are your thoughts about this?
So, I mean, I think David made a lot of very good points about the practical and beneficial things that come from a governmental perspective in terms of engaging in understanding the adaptation and the changes that will need to be made associated with climate change. And I think it is very helpful to be able to articulate those. Many of those come from a science and innovation perspective in terms of how we are going to deal with these things. I think, though, that Steve's points were very important ones. Businesses will respond to the pressures of their stakeholders and their shareholders, and governments will respond to the pressures and the interests that come from their society. So one of the most important things I think that we can do is talk to the publics, to society, to have people understanding, and we have had some fantastic examples of that coming again from young people outside of the conventional political system, from activism that has motivated. Our leaders are not only political leaders. Our leaders are people in positions of authority that sometimes they have gained through their actions. Those are also important influencers who can, again, with support, help societies understand what the issues are, and that will translate itself, into our political and societal leaders.
One thing I've heard said is that there's a worry that there's too much focus on individual consumer choices when actually things need to be made at a big global level between governments. So I just wondered in the closing minutes if any of you had thoughts about how far leaders need to either be just stepping out to take personal responsibility for setting their own bold, ambitious targets instead of waiting for regulation, and how far there's a danger of focusing too much on consumer choice when actually that isn't going to be the thing that really matters.
I think it's really important for leaders to take a stand and drive these objectives before regulation comes around, and do it in a pragmatic way. And I think what's important is to drive progress every single year. And I think the objectives should not be driven by what's woke or what's criticized, because everything a corporation does is criticized. It has to be really aligned with sustainable development goals, climate change goals, corporate social responsibility goals that's relevant to that business.
Any other closing thoughts on this, Arunma?
Well, I was going to add that you need both. You need, I was a regulator for 5 years of the capital markets in Nigeria, and regulation defines the standards and rewards those who are following those standards. So absolutely important. But what brings energy to regulation is when people see that society and consumers are extremely interested in the issue. I think we've made significant progress, particularly in the UK, because of those two tensions. I've been struck by, everybody announced their net zero commitments, and the UK said by 2025 it will do 52%, by 2035 it will do, so by 2030 it will do 52%, by 2035 it will do 78%. Germany came and said, oh yes, we will also do something. So, the spirit of competition amongst the leaders. So greater transparency, greater monitoring, clarity on what people are being judged by. What is success? We need to redefine success as taking care of society, making sure that the world is getting more prosperous.
Fantastic. Can I close with a fantastic comment that's coming from Ed Hill? COVID has produced a nation of armchair epidemiologists who nightly scrutinize data and question assumptions underlying model predictions. This is very healthy. Data is key to designing and evaluation solutions. Test, test, test. Funders need to keep supporting environmental data collection, not swing all research funding to finding solutions. I love the idea that as a nation, and indeed globally, we've all become much more conscious of what does the data show, and then using that and being able to measure constantly where we are. I think that's a very positive place to end this discussion. Thank you all, to all my speakers, for your brilliant insights. I always say I love doing events for Forethought because I feel I learn so much and I find it incredibly optimistic. Thank you for the terrific contributions that have been coming in from all the people watching this. On behalf of the BSA, can I thank the sponsors, EY, Lloyd's Register Foundation, the Institute of Physics and the Natural Environment Research Council. Thanks to those of you who've been joining us on YouTube. I hope you enjoyed the discussion. For those on Zoom, this is the moment where it's a transition. Can I ask that you leave the webinar and join your round table discussion by using the link that you've previously been sent. The discussion will start at 14:10, so 10 past 2, you've got a little 10-minute break. It would really help the BSA if you could join the meeting now. So click on the link, go to that new meeting, then go and take your break and come back. And the roundtable discussions will all finish promptly at 3 o'clock. If you don't have a link, please let the BSA team know through the chat function. They're on it now to check. And thank you again for all your contributions, and have a great afternoon.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thanks all. Thanks, Sam. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
And my apologies, Arunma, for
Oh,
I should have double checked. No, I should have double checked it myself. So
no, not at all, Samira. I actually checked and forwarded it to the team, but I think they must have dealt with the.
And also, I was looking at things quite late today, so as I say, I take responsibility.